we're moving on now to Mike Treen. Hi to Mike, who actually is the National Director of Unite Union and has been a campaigner against war and for economic and social justice since he was in high school, which, not to make any judgments, but I think that's a long time. So, ngā mihi nui mata, hoa mai te paki.
I want to address try to get to a sort of a big question problem, which is that clearly the system is breaking down, right? What is that system that is breaking down? And can we do a system reset by tinkering with the system, or is a more fundamental change necessary? And what is the nature of that change, and how do we begin? All in 10 minutes, of course. We went through a big crisis in this system, which has a name, called capitalism, in the 30s and through World War II. And then we had 3 decades of seemingly uninterrupted growth and the appearance that each decade things would get better, generally. You know, that generally inequality would be muted, that jobs generally would be guaranteed, that healthcare generally would be being extended, that education generally would be getting more accessible. 3 decades, and it seemed like and people get their rights a little bit better. You know, for women, for Māori, for gay people, that would get a little bit better each decade. And then we entered a period of crisis in the late 1970s and in the 1980s, and there was a reset done to the system, and the system since there has not been able to deliver in the same way. In fact, for a generation now, things have actually got worse. Our living standards and real wages and housing is worse than it was a generation ago. This system no longer works. This system no longer can deliver improvements decade after decade, generation after generation. This system is breaking down. It is not the pandemic alone that is doing that. The system has inner cycles and laws that were setting the stage for a new crisis before the pandemic hit. So we had the decade of the 90s of relative sort of strong growth as you recovered again from a crisis. Because normally you have a crisis in the system, it goes down and then it bounces back. And that's the way capitalism has worked for almost 200 years. Every decade it bounces it up. And the system, though, the revolutionary part of capitalism was that the upturns generally were stronger than the downturns. Overall, this is a system of growth. Overall, this is a system of improving productivity. Overall, this is a system that does improve wealth generally in the society. The distribution of that wealth is another question, but that's what it did. But now we have, not only do we have the system unable to generate the wealth that's necessary to people to be able to live well, or it is generating the wealth but it's being captured by a smaller and smaller percentage of the society, and therefore it can't be distributed because they are holding on to it. But the growth that is endemic to the system, its revolutionary character, has become a threat to the planet. Because you have 3% growth every year for 30 years and you double the system. So they double. The system has doubled in size. Every 30 years, it's doubled in size. We cannot double the size of an extractive, exploitative system every 30 years. The planet cannot sustain it. So the system has become incompatible with the life of the planet. This system, which has a name, called capitalism, has become incompatible with the life of the planet. So we need to devise measures that transition beyond the system. They don't tinker with it. And whilst I have been very pleased with many of the Green Party's, for example, whilst I have been impressed by many of the Green Party's policies Over the recent weeks and months, with due with the climate and addressing poverty, I think there is a fundamental problem in what the government is doing. It is relying on a system toy, a mechanism that toys with the system. The emissions trading system, which is trying to use prices to signal people to do the right thing. Well, no, they don't want to do the right thing, and you're not going to trick them into doing the right thing. You have to force them into doing the right thing in a more direct manner. So I've got a sort of a 6-point program. Went through before, which I think are the most important and urgent things that we need to do. Don't necessarily require system change for most of them, but it can get us moving in the right direction, because we also got to begin with empowering people, right? We can't do anything without empowering people, empowering unions, empowering communities at the very bottom. We've got to begin there. How do we empower these communities? How do we empower unions? How do we empower organisations in all of these fields who are wanting to do the right thing? How do we make them stronger and able to empower citizens, right? And so we begin with jobs for all. The jobs for all, it used to be almost an obligation on the government that everyone had a job, right? When I grew up, right, anytime unemployment ticked up above 1 or 2%, the government intervened. The railway started employing another 5,000 or 10,000 people. They just did it. Every railway workshop in the country was a working class university. You went there, you knocked on the door and you got a job. Very soon you were an electrician or a plumber or or just a worker, but you could get a job. And yes, New Zealand Rail lost 200 million a year, but say the fuck what? We had every significant working class community had its little working class university where people could get jobs and get training. And we should be able to do that again. We should be able to put the pieces back together to do that sort of thing again. So yes, jobs for all, and jobs where we begin with jobs where the community does an audit. Every community, we ask, do an audit of your needs, cultural needs, social needs, health needs, connection needs, food. Can you produce food? Can you cook food? Can you share the resources? Can you produce energy? Can you share this energy? Every community, do an audit of the community. What are your needs? And the central government's job is to deliver so that those communities can solve their own problems from the grassroots up, not from the top down. So jobs for all, resource the communities to do it. A living wage for all, just a basic. Everyone, living wage for every single person. And coincidentally, that's sort of the minimum wage. The official policy of Labor and the Greens and the CTU is that the minimum wage should be 2/3 of the average wage, which is sort of the living wage, and that makes sense. But the government should be doing, the government says it supports the living wage, right? Does it tell the companies it owns they should do that? New Zealand Post. Does New Zealand Post, 100% owned by the New Zealand government, pay a living wage? No, it does not. So it's not just the contractors. Who the hell owns the health boards? Do the health boards give a living wage for all their staff? No, they do not. Do they rob them of their annual leave entitlement? Yes, they do, since they owe them $650 million in annual leave entitlement. But, do they deliver them a living job? Does the government fund them to allow them to do that? No, it does not. The government, if it supports a living wage for all, must fund those institutions, so not just the contractors, but also the companies and the institutions that they control, living wage for all. Income support that people have spoken to, but also housing as of right. Housing again used to be something that I grew up in Panmure and GI and the state housing communities in Montreal and so on. And you moved from house to house, right? You had a home for life. They couldn't throw you out of it. They couldn't evict you. Didn't matter what your income was. If you got one for all your life. You could swap. You could change your suburbs. You could move. People might be surprised, but you can move to go to a different suburb if you wanted to. And I lived in a state house my entire life until I left school. It never occurred to me that I would want to buy. Why would you want to buy a house? That seemed an extraordinarily stupid thing to do. Eventually I did, sort of in a sense, because the system forced me to do it, right? We stopped creating communities. You see, when they built Panmure and GI, they didn't build a slum, they built a working class community. Everyone had jobs. Everyone had work. You had your workingmen clubs. You had your party, Labour parties, or whatever. You had your unions, including unions. Very important. All these working class communities were created, and it wasn't something. Housing wasn't something that only the desperately poor or refugee got, right? And you create a system where only the desperately poor or the refugee gets, and you create a system based on resentments. Oh, they're getting it. I'm living in a garage. Why can't they? You're right. You're living in a garage, and you do have a right to a home. And the government should begin by should be doing the minimum 10,000 social homes every year until we eliminate homelessness and poverty and everything else in this country. We have 300,000 temporary migrants in New Zealand, right? We are not going and cannot deport 300,000 people, right? Probably half of those people, there's a whole bunch of students and so on, at least half of them are what the Minister of Immigration calls normally resident New Zealanders. That is, they've renewed their visa again and again, their children have been born, going to school here, they maybe have partners, they have never been allowed they've been brought in and on these recycled temporary visas that are not essential skills, they are essential skills, but not important enough to be able to transition to permanent resident. They were brought here on a lie, deception. They've been billed and cheated out of tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees that they did for their courses, fees they've given to Immigration New Zealand. They have been cheated and lied to, and they deserve to be transitioned to permanent residence immediately if they want to. They have made this country their home, and we have to allow them to stay if they want to. And we cannot throw them out. So we empower community power. Now, the final thing is we have created a system. Capitalism is a system of commodity production for profit, right? And they try to impose those system values on everything else. They try to impose it on education and health. They try to impose it, on the post office, on Air New Zealand, on Kiwi Rail, on public services like transport and so on, right? So they, in fact, law, you have to rip people off and seek to make a profit. Like that power company recently, which is just an extraordinarily cheating and sort of, just lying, because they're sort of a law. They've got to make a profit. They've got to sell commodities. It's a law, right? We've got to change. We've got to decommodify things more and more, right? We're going to decommodify the sectors of education that have commodified, like the early childcare sector. We're going to decommodify the health sectors that have been, like the aged care. Who decided that aged care was going to be a for-profit damn business, right? Who decided? Nobody. No sane person in this country would make that decision, except it's been allowed to happen. Early education and the care of aged, completely nuts. So we've got to move to decommodify things more and more. So we don't need McDonald's, they represent 1,000 McDonald's workers. You know what I mean? If we're supporting businesses, then we need to, and so on, through this period of crisis, which will often happen, we've got to look to how we can do things differently, how we can produce food and feed ourselves differently, how we can produce housing and house ourselves, how we can do the healthcare. We've got to be able to do all of it differently, not based on the pursuit of profit and selfish needs, but on basis of solidarity and support for one another.
Kia ora, tēnā koe. Tēnā koe e te manu wheko ata. Kia ora. Is that a man who's been in the union for many years, or is that a man who's been in the union for many years? Tēnā koe te kai kōrero. Yeah, we have to go forward in the future by knowing our past, right? Yeah, kia ora.